If you're enjoying this video, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Share it with your friends, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Every like and subscribe helps the channel grow. My name is Diana Powell. I'm a park ranger and botanist, but my specialty is fungi, mushrooms, molds, and everything in between. Some people think that's weird, but I've always found them fascinating. They're like nature's recyclers, breaking down what's dead to make way for new life. At least, that's what I used to believe. I was transferred to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in Tennessee a few months ago. It wasn't by choice. Back in Yellowstone, I went through something terrible. My research partner, Sam, and I were working deep in the back country when we found something, or maybe it found us. I'll never forget the day I stumbled upon his body, torn apart like some wild animal had gotten to him. But there were no tracks, no signs of a struggle, just him and the strange patch of black fungus growing all around him. After that, I couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight. The nightmares were bad enough, but then came the hallucinations, flashes of movement in the corner of my eye, whispers that weren't there. My supervisors said I needed a fresh start, so they sent me here. At first, it was peaceful. The Smokies are beautiful, rolling hills covered in misty forests that stretch as far as the eye can see. I spent my days cataloging plants and fungi, hiking trails, and helping visitors with their questions. It was quiet work, just what I needed to clear my head. But then the rain came. It poured for days, flooding trails and turning the forest floor into a soggy mess. After the storm passed, I went out to assess the damage and stumbled across something strange. In a clearing, near one of the less traveled trails, there was this massive patch of mushrooms, bright orange with white spots, arranged in perfect geometric patterns like spirals and circles. It didn't look natural at all. I knelt down to take a closer look and noticed something even stranger. The soil around them was packed with tiny white threads, mycelium, the underground network fungi used to communicate and share nutrients. But this wasn't normal mycelium. It was dense, almost like a web stretching out in every direction. I took a sample back to the lab for analysis. Under the microscope, it looked alive, not just alive like a plant or fungus. It pulsed, almost like it had a heartbeat. That night, as I sat alone in my cabin reviewing my notes, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and for just a moment I thought I heard whispers, soft voices carried on the breeze. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I got a call from the main ranger station. A family of 4 had gone missing overnight. They'd been camping at one of the more remote sites, and when another group of hikers passed by that morning, they found the family's tent abandoned. I was assigned to check the site. When I arrived, it looked wrong. The tent was still standing, but inside, there were half-eaten plates of food left out, like they'd been interrupted mid-meal. What caught my attention most was the food itself. It was covered in mold. Not just a little bit, either. Thick patches of green and black fuzz had grown all over it, like it had been sitting there for weeks instead of hours. Outside the tent, I found 4 sets of footprints leading away into the woods. They were deep in the mud, clear as day. But here's where it got strange. About 20 feet into the forest, one set of footprints just stopped. No signs of someone turning back or stepping off the trail, just gone. The other 3 sets kept going deeper into the trees before eventually fading away. I radioed back to the station to report what I'd found and joined the search team combing through the woods. We didn't find anything that day, no sign of the family, no clues about where they might have gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those footprints and how one set had just disappeared like that. As I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I heard something outside my cabin window. At first, I thought it was just the wind again, but then I realized it wasn't random noise, it was birdsong. But not normal birdsong. The chirps and whistles sounded off. They were too sharp, too deliberate. I grabbed my recorder and stepped outside to capture it. As soon as I hit record and listened closely, my stomach dropped. The birds weren't singing. They were mimicking human voices. It wasn't as perfect, just fragments of words, but I could hear them clearly. Below. Hungry. Help us. I stood frozen on my porch for what felt like forever before finally going back inside and locking the door behind me. I played back the recording over and over again that night, trying to convince myself there was some logical explanation for what I'd heard. But deep down, I knew there wasn't set. The search for the missing family stretched into the next day. Rangers were combing through the woods, but no one had found anything. Not a clue, not a trace. Then, just before sunset, one of my colleagues, Ranger Tom Harris, radioed in. He said he'd found something near the edge of the search area and was heading back to the station. When Tom arrived, something felt off. He was acting strange, jumpy, and distracted. Normally, Tom was sharp and focused, but now he seemed confused, like he couldn't remember basic procedures. When I asked him where exactly he'd been searching, he gave me vague answers that didn't make sense. Just out there, he said, waving his hand toward the woods. I noticed his uniform was dirty, his boots caked with mud and his collar dusted with soil. That wasn't unusual for a ranger after a long day in the field. But when I looked closer at his boots, something caught my eye. The mud didn't match the soil from any of the areas we'd been searching. It was darker, almost black, and it smelled strange, like damp rot. I tried not to jump to conclusions. Maybe he'd wandered into an unmarked area or gotten turned around on one of the trails. But as I watched him walk away toward his truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Later that night, I decided to map out all of the recent disappearances in the park. Not just this family, but every case I could find going back years. It wasn't easy. Some records were incomplete or buried in old files. But as I pieced everything together, a pattern started to emerge. Almost every disappearance happened after heavy rains or flooding events, just like this one. And when I plotted them on a map, they formed a spiral pattern that expanded outward from a central point deep in the wilderness. The center of that spiral, a remote area called Devil's Hollow. I'd heard stories about Devil's Hollow before, a place so overgrown and tangled that even experienced hikers avoided it. Some said it was cursed. Others said it was just dangerous terrain. But now I had reason to believe there was something more to it. I couldn't stop thinking about Tom and how strange he'd acted earlier. Was it possible he'd been near Devil's Hollow? Could that explain why his boots were covered in soil? I didn't recognize. I decided to confront him about it the next morning, but when I called his cabin, there was no answer. I drove to Tom's cabin first thing in the morning. His truck was parked outside, but the place was eerily quiet. I knocked on the door, waited, and knocked again. No answer. Finally, I tried the handle. It wasn't locked. Inside, it looked like he'd left in a hurry. His ranger uniform was tossed on the floor, and his gear was scattered across the table. But what caught my attention most was his boots. They were sitting by the door, still caked in that strange black soil. I leaned closer to examine them and noticed something horrifying. Tiny white threads were growing out of the mud. They looked like roots or fungal mycelium, stretching and curling like they were alive. Suddenly, I heard a sound behind me, a soft creak of wood. I turned around quickly, my heart pounding. Tom was standing there in the doorway, staring at me. "Tom," I said cautiously. He didn't respond right away. His face looked pale, almost grayish, and his eyes were glassy, like he wasn't really seeing me. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded wrong. It was flat and fragmented, like he was struggling to form sentences. "You shouldn't that be here," he said slowly. I stepped back toward the door, trying to stay calm. "Tom, are you okay? Where were you yesterday?" He didn't answer. Instead, he took a step forward, and as he moved, soil crumbled from his collar and sleeves like it was falling off his skin. That's when I noticed something else. His hands weren't normal anymore. The skin looked rough and cracked, with tiny green shoots poking through like plants growing out of him. I bolted for the door without another word and drove straight back to the ranger station. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep hold of the wheel. Whatever had happened to Tom wasn't natural. It wasn't human. Back at the station, I pulled out my maps again and stared at the spiral pattern of disappearances leading to Devil's Hollow. I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to go there myself. The hike to Devil's Hollow was long and grueling. The trails became less defined the deeper I went into the woods, until eventually there were no trails at all, just dense undergrowth and towering trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. When I finally reached the hollow itself, I froze in place. The ground was covered in massive root-like structures that pulsed faintly with bioluminescent light, soft greens and blues glowing beneath layers of soil and leaves. Some of them formed shapes that looked almost human, hand-like structures reaching up from the earth, before retreating when I shined my flashlight on them. In the center of the hollow was a massive depression filled with composting remains, bones tangled with roots and partially formed plant-human hybrids reaching out weakly with mouths that whispered softly, "Help us." I felt sick to my stomach, but forced myself to move closer. As horrifying as it was, I needed answers and samples for testing. But as I knelt down to collect a sample from one of the glowing roots, something moved behind me. I froze. The sound behind me was soft at first, a faint rustling like leaves brushing against each other. Then it grew louder, heavier, like something big was moving through the undergrowth. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I turned slowly, gripping my flashlight tight in one hand and my sample bag in the other. At first, I didn't see anything, just shadows shifting between the trees. But then, I saw him. It was Tom. Or at least it looked like Tom. He stepped into the clearing, his movements stiff and unnatural, like a puppet being dragged along by invisible strings. His skin was worse now, gray and cracked, with patches of moss and tiny flowers growing out of him. His eyes were empty, lifeless. "Diana," he said in that same flat, broken voice, "you shouldn't still be here." I backed away slowly, trying to keep my flashlight trained on him. "Tom, what's happening to you? What is this place?" He tilted his head slightly, as if he didn't understand the question. Then his mouth twisted into a strange smile, a smile that didn't belong on his face. "It's Set's hungry," he said. Before I could respond, he lunged at me. I stumbled backward, dropping my sample bag as his hands reached for me. They felt rough and cold, like bark instead of skin. I managed to push him off and ran as fast as I could back toward the trail, my flashlight bouncing wildly in the darkness. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck. My chest was burning from the effort, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get as far away from Devil's Hollow as possible. Back at the station, I locked myself in the lab and started researching everything I could about Devil's Hollow and the strange fungal network I'd seen. The glowing roots reminded me of something I'd read years ago, an old Cherokee legend about a hungry shadow beneath the soil. According to the stories, it wasn't just a shadow, it was alive, a creature that woke up every few decades to feed on whatever wandered too close. The more I dug into park records, the more connections I found. In 1934, during a civilian conservation corps project in the area, workers reported finding a devil's garden filled with strange plants and glowing fungi. Soon after that discovery, they vanished without a trace. Every few decades since then, always after heavy rains, people had gone missing near Devil's Hollow. Hikers, campers, even rangers like Tom. It all pointed back to one thing, the root mass. I realized then that it wasn't just feeding on people, it was using them, absorbing them into its network to grow stronger and spread farther. And now, it was spreading faster than ever. I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen in Devil's Hollow. The glowing roots, the compost pit filled with human remains, and Tom, or whatever he had become. I knew I couldn't let this go. If the root mass was spreading, it wasn't just a danger to the park, it could be a danger to everyone. But then something happened that made me realize how close I was to becoming part of its network myself. The next morning, as I was reviewing my notes in the lab, I started to feel strange. My head was spinning, and my hands felt heavy, like they weren't mine anymore. When I looked down at my arm, I saw faint red lines running along my veins, almost like roots growing under my skin. I panicked and stumbled toward the sink, splashing cold water on my face, but it didn't help. The hallucinations started almost immediately. In my mind, I saw roots bursting out of my body, curling around my arms and legs like vines. I could hear whispers again, soft voices telling me to lie down, to rest, to let go. I realized then what was happening. The spores, the root mass had released hallucinogenic spores into the air back in Devil's Hollow, and I must have inhaled them. They were affecting my brain chemistry, trying to pull me into its network, just like it had done to Tom. But there was one thing working in my favor: my PTSD medication. The pills I'd been taking since Yellowstone were designed to stabilize neural activity, and they seemed to be slowing down the infection, at least for now. I knew I couldn't rely on the medication alone. If I wanted to survive and stop the root mass, I needed a way to fight back. Using everything I'd learned about fungi over the years, I started working on a fungicide that could target the root mass's network without harming other plants in the park. It wasn't easy. Most fungicides are designed for small-scale use, not massive underground organisms like this one. But after hours of trial and error, I finally created something that might work, a concentrated solution that could disrupt fungal growth at its source. I packed up my gear and prepared to head back to Devil's Hollow. My hands were still shaking from the hallucinations, but I didn't have a choice. If I waited any longer, the infection would spread too far for me and for everyone else. Before leaving, I tested the fungicide on one of the soil samples from Devil's Hollow. As soon as it touched the black threads of mycelium, they shriveled up and turned gray. A good sign. But then something unexpected happened. The sample started pulsing faster than before, almost like it was fighting back. That's when I realized just how intelligent this organism really was. It wasn't set just alive, it was aware. I knew I couldn't wait any longer. The root mass was spreading, and every second I hesitated felt like another step closer to losing myself, or worse, letting it take over everything around me. I packed the fungicide, my flashlight, and a lighter. If this didn't work, I'd need a backup plan. The hike back to Devil's Hollow felt different. This time, the forest was quieter than usual. No bird song, no rustling leaves, just an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. Every step felt heavier, like the ground itself was trying to pull me down. The hallucinations hadn't stopped either. I kept seeing flashes of movement in the trees and hearing whispers that weren't there. When I finally reached the hollow, it looked even worse than before. The glowing roots were brighter now, pulsing faster like they were alive and aware of my presence. The compost pit had grown larger too, with more plant-human hybrids reaching out weakly from the mass. Their mouths moved silently, but I could feel their whispers in my mind. Join us. I forced myself to focus and move toward the center of the hollow where the largest root structures were clustered around an ancient tree. Its trunk was massive, twisted and gnarled like it had been growing for centuries. Surrounding it were dozens of fungal fruiting bodies, giant mushrooms releasing clouds of spores into the air. This was it, the heart of the root mass. As I approached, I heard movement behind me. I turned quickly and saw them, the hybrids. There were dozens of them now, shambling toward me with stiff movements like puppets on strings. Some were human-like, with patches of moss and bark covering their skin. Others were barely recognizable as people anymore, their bodies completely consumed by plants. Among them were faces I recognized, the missing family from the campground. They moved together in perfect synchronization, their eyes empty but fixed on me. "Stop," I said weakly, knowing it wouldn't make a difference. One of them stepped forward. It was Tom. His voice was softer this time, almost pleading. "You don't understand," he said. "It's steps saving us." I backed away slowly, gripping the fungicide in one hand and my flashlight in the other. "Saving you? It sits killing you." "No," he said. "It steps elevating us." Before he could say anything else, I threw the fungicide onto one of the glowing roots near the tree. It hissed and bubbled as the mycelium shriveled up and turned gray. The hybrid screamed, not in pain but in anger, and rushed toward me all at once. I grabbed my lighter and ignited a bottle of homemade napalm I'd brought as a last resort. The fire spread quickly across the roots and fruiting bodies, sending thick black smoke into the air. The hybrids stopped moving and stood frozen, as if they were disconnected from something larger. But then, the ground shifted beneath me. The tree itself started to move, its massive branches twisting and curling like arms reaching for me. Roots shot up from the earth, wrapping around my legs and pulling me down toward the compost pit. The whispers grew louder in my mind. You can be part of us forever. The roots tightened around my legs, pulling me closer to the pit. I struggled against them, clawing at the ground and kicking as hard as I could, but they were too strong. The whispers in my mind grew louder, almost deafening now. Let go, they said. You shall never be alone again. I reached for my lighter, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. With one last burst of strength, I flicked it on and held it against the remaining napalm. The flames roared to life, spreading across the tree and its roots faster than I expected. The hybrids screamed again, their voices echoing through the hollow as they collapsed one by one. The roots around my legs loosened just enough for me to pull free. I scrambled away from the pit, coughing as thick smoke filled the air. The fire consumed everything. The glowing roots, the fruiting bodies, even the ancient tree at the center of it all. For a moment, I thought I'd done it, that I'd stopped the root mass for good. But then, I felt it. A sharp pain shot through my arm, and when I looked down, I saw tiny white threads growing out of my skin. The spores had gotten to me after all. I stumbled out of Devil's Hollow as fast as I could, barely able to keep myself upright. My vision blurred and the whispers in my mind faded into silence. By the time I reached my truck, everything went black. I woke up a month later in a hospital bed. At first I didn't know where I was or how I'd gotten there. My body felt weak and my skin burned like it was on fire. The doctors told me they'd found me unconscious near my truck after a massive wildfire swept through the park. They said I was lucky to be alive, but when they examined me further, they realized something was wrong. Underneath my skin were tiny root-like structures, too small to see with the naked eye but visible under medical imaging. They couldn't explain it. They said it was like nothing they'd ever seen before. I tried to tell them about Devil's Hollow and the root mass, but no one believed me. They said my injuries were caused by smoke inhalation and exhaustion, that everything else was just hallucinations from stress and trauma. But I knew better. Even now, lying here in this hospital bed, I can feel it growing inside me. The plants in my room grow faster than normal, vines curling toward me like they're drawn to something in my body. At night, when everything is quiet, I hear whispers again, soft voices naming plants and fungi in languages I don't understand. I don't know how much longer I have before it takes over completely. But one thing is certain, the root mass isn't gone. It too's waiting. My name is Jack Emerson. I'm a winter ranger at Denali National Park in Alaska, and I've been doing this job for nearly 15 years. I know these mountains better than I know myself. The cold doesn't bother me anymore. Not since I lost 3 fingers to frostbite during a climbing accident in the Alps years ago. People say I'm tough, but the truth is, I'm just stubborn. You don't survive winters like this without being stubborn. But there's something about Denali that feels different this year. The snow falls heavier, the nights stretch longer, and the silence, it's not peaceful. It's heavy, like the mountains are holding their breath, waiting for something. I've seen storms that could bury a man alive and winds sharp enough to cut through bone, but this feels wrong. It started 2 nights ago when I was patrolling near the northern edge of the park during a blizzard. The wind was howling so loud it drowned out every other sound. But through the noise, I saw something strange. A cabin light flickering in the distance. It wasn't supposed to be there. No one was scheduled to be in that area. Curious and worried someone might be stranded, I made my way toward it. The cabin was small and sturdy, built for researchers who study wildlife in the winter months. When I got closer, I noticed the door was wide open, swinging back and forth in the wind like it had been left that way in a hurry. Inside, there was a table set with dinner, hot soup still steaming in bowls, but no sign of anyone. It was like they had vanished into thin air. That's when I saw it, the frost on the windows. At first glance, it looked normal, just ice crystals forming patterns on the glass. But when I looked closer, I realized it wasn't random. The frost formed intricate shapes like symbols or runes, patterns that seemed to shift whenever I turned my head away. I felt a chill run down my spine, not from the cold outside, but from something deeper, something primal. It was like the cabin itself was watching me. And then I heard it, a faint sound coming from somewhere outside. It wasn't the wind or snow, it sounded like footsteps crunching through ice. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the storm. The snow was coming down hard, thick flakes whipping through the air like tiny knives. I could barely see a few feet in front of me, but I kept moving toward the sound of those footsteps. My flashlight beam cut through the storm, bouncing off the ice-covered trees around me. The whole world felt frozen, like time itself had stopped. I followed the tracks in the snow. They started just outside the cabin and led away into the woods. At first, they looked normal. Boot prints, maybe from one of the researchers, but as I walked further, something didn't add up. The stride between each step grew longer, far longer than any human could manage, and the depth of the prints, it was as if whatever made them weighed hundreds of pounds. I stopped and crouched down to get a closer look. The edges of the prints were sharp and clean, like they'd been carved into the snow instead of pressed into it. My breath fogged up in front of me as I stared at them, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then I noticed something else. There were no other signs of movement around them, no scuff marks, no disturbed snow where someone might have slipped or stumbled, just these perfect, impossible tracks leading deeper into the forest. I followed them for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. The wind screamed through the trees, and every crunch of my boots on the snow sounded louder than it should have. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to know where these tracks led. And then, they just stopped, right there in the middle of an open stretch of snow, surrounded by trees. The tracks ended abruptly. No sign of whoever or whatever had made them. No trail leading away, no broken branches or disturbed ground, just pristine snow stretching out in every direction. I shone my flashlight around, searching for anything that might explain it, but there was nothing, only silence and the cold pressing in around me. I don't know why I said it out loud, but I did. "Hello? Is anyone out here?" The wind answered with a low moan that almost sounded like a voice. My stomach tightened as I realized how far I'd wandered from the cabin. The storm was getting worse, and if I didn't turn back soon, I might not find my way out. But before I could move, I felt a shift in the air behind me, like someone was standing there. I spun around so fast I nearly lost my footing. My flashlight swept over the trees and snow-covered ground, but there was nothing there. Nothing, except for a faint outline in the frost on one of the tree trunks, a pattern that looked eerily similar to what I'd seen on the cabin windows. I didn't waste any more time. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to meet it. I turned back toward the cabin, trying to retrace my steps in the snow. The wind was stronger now, and the tracks I'd made earlier were already starting to disappear under fresh snowfall. My flashlight flickered once, and my stomach dropped. "Not now," I muttered, giving it a shake. By the time I reached the cabin, the storm was in full force. The door was still swinging open, creaking on its hinges. I stepped inside and slammed it shut behind me, leaning against it for a moment to catch my breath. The warmth from the untouched dinner on the table had faded, and the room felt colder than ever. I went straight to the radio on the desk in the corner. Every research cabin has one. It's standard protocol for emergencies. Static crackled as I turned the dial, trying to reach park headquarters. "This is Ranger Emerson," I said, my voice steady despite the knot in my chest. "I sep in that cabin 3 near the northern edge of the park. Something sep's wrong here. Over." For a moment, there was nothing but static. Then, faintly, I heard something, voices buried beneath the noise. At first, I thought it was just interference from the storm, but as I listened closer, I realized they weren't random sounds. They were words. "Help us," a voice whispered, so faint I could barely hear it. "He seps here in the cold." My hand froze on the radio dial. "Who is this? Identify yourself," I demanded. The static grew louder, almost deafening, and then cut out completely. The radio went dead. I stared at it for a long moment before grabbing my gear and heading back outside. Whatever was happening here wasn't normal, and I needed answers. I decided to head toward a nearby survey site where one of our park geologists had been working earlier in the week. If anyone else was out here, they might know what was going on, or at least confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. The trek through the storm felt endless. The snow stung my face, and every step felt heavier than the last. Finally, through the swirling white, I saw it, the outline of a small tent set up near a rocky outcrop. "Hello?" I called out as I approached. There was no answer. I unzipped the tent flap and froze. Inside was the geologist, or what was left of him. He was sitting upright, his eyes wide open and staring straight ahead. His entire body was encased in ice, clear as glass, like he'd been frozen solid in an instant. His face was twisted in an expression of pure terror. But what made my blood run cold wasn't just how he looked. It was his eyes. They weren't lifeless, like you'd expect from someone who'd been dead for hours or days. They were moving, following me as I stepped closer. I stumbled back out of the tent, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. This wasn't possible. None of this was possible. The storm howled around me as I stood there, staring at that frozen figure inside the tent. For a moment, I thought about turning back to safety, heading straight for headquarters and leaving this nightmare behind. But something deep inside me wouldn't let me walk away. I forced myself to move. Standing there in the storm, staring at that frozen man, wasn't going to help anyone, not him, not me. I zipped the tent shut and trudged back toward the cabin. My thoughts were racing, but I couldn't make sense of any of it. How could someone freeze solid like that? And those eyes, they weren't natural. They were alive or something close to it. Back at the cabin, I grabbed the logbook we keep for recording incidents in the park. It's old, filled with years of notes from rangers before me. If something like this had ever happened before, maybe there'd be a record of it. I flipped through page after page, scanning for anything that might explain what I'd seen. At first, there was nothing, just routine reports about wildlife sightings and weather conditions. But then, buried deep in the older entries, I found something. In 1920, during a winter colder than any on record, 2 researchers disappeared near the same area. Their bodies were found weeks later, frozen solid and standing upright in the snow like statues. The ranger who found them described strange frost patterns on the trees nearby, patterns that looked like ancient symbols. And it wasn't just 1920. There was another report from 1887. Same story. Record-breaking cold, people vanishing, bodies frozen in impossible ways. The ranger who wrote that entry mentioned warnings from the local Athabascan people about a winter spirit that awakens every few decades, a being they called the Shepherd of Souls. I sat back in my chair, my hands shaking as I stared at the logbook. Was this what I was dealing with? Some kind of creature? A legend come to life? Before I could think too much about it, I heard a noise outside, a faint cry for help carried on the wind. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the storm again. The sound was coming from somewhere nearby, a voice weak and desperate. "Help, please." I followed it through the snow until I found him, a trapper half buried in a snowdrift. His face was pale, his lips blue from the cold. He looked up at me with wide eyes as I knelt beside him. "I saw him," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "He led me here, said he'd sit help." "Who?" I asked urgently. "Who led you here?" The trapper Sip's breathing was shallow, his words broken by shivers. A ranger, but his legs, they bent backward, and his face, his voice cracked as tears froze on his cheeks. It opened up like a flower. I felt a chill run down my spine, not from the cold, but from something deeper, something primal. I tried to get him on his feet, but he collapsed against me, his body limp and icy to the touch. I carried him back to the cabin as fast as I could and laid him near the fire. His skin felt like ice even though flames roared just inches away. "Stay awake," I told him firmly as I piled blankets over him, but his breathing slowed with every passing second until it stopped altogether. I sat there staring at him for what felt like hours, trying to process what he'd said and what had happened to him. I sat in the cabin, staring at the fire. The trapper's words echoed in my head, twisting and turning until I couldn't think straight. His legs bent backward, his face opened up like a flower. What had he seen? What had led him to this place? And why did it feel like I was being pulled deeper into something I couldn't escape? As I tried to make sense of it all, I started hearing faint sounds outside like whispers carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but the longer I listened, the clearer they became. They weren't random, they were voices. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the storm again. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding me. "Jack?" One voice said softly, almost too quiet to hear. "Jack, why did you leave me?" My heart stopped. I knew that voice. It was Mark, the climbing partner I'd abandoned in the Alps 7 years ago. The guilt of leaving him behind had haunted me every day since, but hearing his voice now, it wasn't possible. He was gone. He had to be. I turned toward the sound, shining my flashlight into the snow. For a moment, I saw nothing but swirling flakes and shadows, but then through the haze I saw him. Mark stood a few feet away, his frostbitten skin blackened and cracked like old leather, but beneath those cracks something gleamed. A pale blue light that shimmered like ice. His eyes locked onto mine, and he smiled. A slow, unnatural smile that sent chills down my spine. "Why did you leave me?" he asked again, his voice calm but hollow. I stumbled back, shaking my head. "You star not real," I said firmly, trying to convince myself as much as him. But he didn't disappear. Instead, he stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. With each step, the frost on the ground seemed to spread outward from his feet, creeping toward me like living tendrils. I turned and ran. The storm swallowed me whole as I sprinted through the snow, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get away from him. But no matter how far I ran, the whispers followed me. Eventually, I stumbled into a clearing and stopped dead in my tracks. In front of me was a cave. A dark opening carved into the side of a rocky hill. Something about it felt wrong, but at the same time, I couldn't turn away. It was like it was calling to me. I stepped inside. The air inside the cave was colder than anything I'd ever felt before, so cold it burned my skin with every breath. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness and revealed what lay within. Dozens of people stood frozen in ice columns arranged in concentric circles around the cave floor. Their faces were twisted in expressions of fear and pain, their bodies preserved so perfectly it looked like they'd been frozen mid-movement. Some of them weren't fully human anymore, their limbs elongated unnaturally, their skin translucent like frosted glass. Others looked almost normal but had that same faint blue glow beneath their skin that I'd seen on Mark. I moved closer to one of the columns and stared at the face inside, a woman with wide eyes and an open mouth frozen mid-scream. Her gaze seemed to follow me as I moved around her. Suddenly, I felt a sharp gust of wind behind me. The storm had followed me into the cave, and with it came something else. I turned around, gripping my flashlight tightly, but the beam barely cut through the icy wind swirling inside the cave. The storm wasn't natural anymore. It was alive, moving with purpose. The snow twisted and churned, forming shapes that looked almost like faces before disappearing into the darkness. I backed away from the ice columns, my breath fogging up in front of me. My heart was racing, and my legs felt like they might give out at any moment. I didn't know what was coming, but I could feel it. The air was heavy, charged with something I couldn't explain. Then I saw it. At first it was just a shadow in the storm. A tall figure moving slowly toward me, but as it stepped closer, its shape became clearer. The Frost Shepherd. It was massive, 12 feet tall, its translucent blue skin glowing faintly in the darkness. Its antlers stretched wide like frozen branches, glinting in the light of my flashlight. Its body was emaciated, almost skeletal, but it moved with a strange grace that made it even more terrifying. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was stare as it stopped a few feet away from me. The storm quieted around us, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then I heard its voice, not out loud, but inside my head. It wasn't words exactly, more like thoughts pressed into my mind. "Yuseb come far," it said, its voice cold and hollow. "You carry guilt, a burden you cannot escape." I shook my head, trying to block out its voice. What do you want? I managed to whisper. It tilted its head slightly, those antlers catching the faint light like shards of glass. A choice, it said simply. The storm picked up again, swirling around us as the frost shepherd stepped closer. Its icy tendrils reached out toward me, not touching me yet, but close enough that I could feel the cold radiating from them. I will release them, it said, its thoughts filling my mind with images of the frozen people in the cave thawing and waking up. But you must take their place. I stumbled back, shaking my head furiously. No, no way. The frost shepherd's steps gaze didn't waver. You left him, it said, a sharp stab of guilt hitting me as Mark's steps face flashed in my mind again. You chose yourself over another. Its tendrils stretched closer now, brushing against my skin like icy knives. Choose again. I wanted to run to escape this nightmare, but something held me in place. The frost shepherd's presence was overwhelming, pressing down on me like an invisible weight. And then I saw them, two figures stumbling into the cave through the storm. It was two young rangers from headquarters, who must have come searching for me when I didn't check in. No, I shouted as they froze in place at the sight of the frost shepherd. The creature turned toward them slowly, its icy tendrils reaching out again, this time toward them. I watched in horror as the frost shepherd's icy tendrils reached toward the two rangers. They were frozen in place, their faces pale and wide-eyed, unable to move or speak. The storm seemed to wrap around them like a living thing, pulling them closer to the creature. Stop, I shouted, stepping forward without thinking. Take me instead. Leave them alone. The frost shepherd didn't react right away. It simply turned its head toward me, those glowing antlers catching the dim light. For a moment, I thought it might listen, that I might have a chance to save them. But then it spoke again, not with words but with thoughts pressed into my mind. You are already mine. The storm swirled faster now, and I felt the air grow colder, so cold it burned my skin. The frost shepherd's tendrils wrapped around the legs of the first ranger, and I could see ice forming on his boots, creeping upward like vines. He gasped, his breath visible in the freezing air, but he couldn't move. No. I yelled again, rushing toward him. But before I could reach him, the frost shepherd's voice filled my head once more. You carry guilt, it said, its tone calm but unrelenting. You abandoned him. I stopped in my tracks as Mark's face appeared in my mind again. His frost-bitten skin cracked and glowing with ice. The memories of that day in the Alps came flooding back. The blizzard, the crevasse, his screams for help as I climbed out and left him behind. You did not save him, the frost shepherd continued, its voice cutting through me like a knife. And now he is mine. I stared at the creature in disbelief as it stepped closer to me. What are you talking about? I demanded. The frost shepherd tilted its head slightly, and for a moment its translucent skin seemed to shift, revealing something beneath it. Mark's face appeared briefly within the creature's form, his eyes glowing with that same faint blue light. No, I whispered, shaking my head. That's not possible. But deep down I knew it was true. Mark hadn't died in that crevasse, not completely. He had become part of this thing, absorbed into it somehow. The frost shepherd's tendrils wrapped around the second ranger now, and ice began creeping up her legs too. She cried out in pain as the cold consumed her, freezing her from the feet up. I stood there helplessly, watching as both rangers were slowly encased in ice, their faces twisted in fear and agony, their bodies stiffening until they were frozen solid, just like the geologist I'd found earlier. The frost shepherd turned back to me once more. Choose, it said simply. I stood there, my breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. The two rangers were frozen solid now, their faces locked in expressions of terror, their bodies encased in crystal-clear ice. The frost shepherd loomed over them, its antlers shimmering like jagged spears of glass. The storm howled around us, but all I could hear was the pounding of my heart. Choose, it whispered again in my mind, its voice cold and hollow. I clenched my fists, my mind racing. There had to be a way to stop this thing, some way to end this nightmare. My eyes darted around the cave, searching for anything I could use. Then I remembered the propane tanks back at the research cabin. If I could lure the frost shepherd there and ignite the tanks, maybe, just maybe, I could destroy it. I said'll do it, I said aloud. My voice trembling but firm. I said'll take their place. The frost shepherd tilted its head, as if studying me. Its icy tendrils began to retreat from the frozen rangers, and for a moment I felt a flicker of hope. But then I saw the faint blue glow beneath their skin, the same glow I'd seen in Mark. Even if they thawed, they wouldn't be the same. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to focus. But not here, I added quickly. Let Seps finish this where it started at the cabin. The creature didn't respond right away. It just stood there, its antlers catching the faint light like shards of ice. Finally, it began to move, its long limbs gliding across the frozen ground with an unnatural grace. I turned and ran. The storm followed me as I sprinted back toward the cabin, the wind biting at my face and tearing at my clothes. My lungs burned with every breath, but I didn't stop. Behind me, I could hear the frost shepherd's footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the snow like breaking glass. When I reached the cabin, I threw open the door and stumbled inside. My hands shook as I grabbed one of the propane tanks from under the counter and set it in the middle of the room. Then I grabbed another and another, arranging them in a circle around me. The frost shepherd appeared in the doorway a moment later, its towering form blocking out the storm behind it. It stepped inside slowly, its antlers nearly scraping against the ceiling. I held up my lighter with trembling fingers. Come on, I said through gritted teeth. Let Spence finish this. The creature moved closer, its icy tendrils reaching out toward me. As they wrapped around my arms and legs, I felt a searing cold unlike anything I'd ever experienced, like knives slicing through my skin and freezing my blood at the same time. The frost shepherd leaned in closer, its hollow eyes staring into mine. For a moment, I thought I saw Mark's face again, his lips moving as if he were trying to speak. I said, "I'm sorry," I whispered. Then I flicked the lighter. The explosion was deafening. A wave of heat and light engulfed me as the propane tanks ignited, shattering the windows and sending flames roaring through the cabin. The force threw me backward into the wall, and everything went dark. When I opened my eyes, everything was quiet. The storm had stopped, and the only sound was the crackling of dying flames. I was lying on the floor of what was left of the cabin, surrounded by shattered wood and broken glass. My body ached all over, and every breath felt like fire in my lungs. I forced myself to sit up, wincing as pain shot through my ribs. The frost shepherd was gone. There was no sign of it anywhere. The air felt lighter, warmer, as if whatever dark presence had been here was finally gone. Then I saw them, the two rangers. They were lying in the snow just outside the cabin, their ice-covered bodies beginning to thaw. I crawled toward them, my heart pounding. Their faces were pale, their clothes soaked from the melting ice, but they were breathing alive. I let out a shaky breath, relief washing over me like a wave. Somehow they'd survived. The rescue team arrived hours later after receiving a garbled distress call from my radio. They found me sitting in the snow outside the burned remains of the cabin, wrapped in a blanket and staring at nothing. The rangers were taken to the hospital, and though they were shaken and frostbitten, they would recover. As for me, I wasn't set the same. The doctor said I had severe burns on my hands and arms from the explosion, but that wasn't what bothered me. It was what came after. My hair turned completely white within days, and no matter how warm it was, my skin always felt cold to the touch. Sometimes, when I held something for too long, a cup of coffee, a pen, it would frost over as if touched by winter itself. I didn't tell anyone about what really happened that night. They wouldn't have believed me anyway, but deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Years passed, and life moved on. I retired from being a ranger and moved to a small cabin on the edge of town. Winters came and went like they always did, but every time the first snowfall of the season arrived, I felt that same heavy silence in the air. Then one night in 1988, more than 30 years after that terrible winter, I woke up to find frost patterns forming on my windows again. They weren't random, they were runes, just like before. I knew what it meant. I packed my gear, warm clothes, food supplies, and grabbed an old flamethrower I'd kept hidden away for years. As I stepped outside into the falling snow, I could feel it again, that presence watching me from somewhere deep in the woods. This time I wouldn't set run. The last anyone saw of me was that night as I walked into the blizzard with nothing but my pack and my flamethrower slung over my shoulder. Some say I went looking for it, hunting it down to finish what I started all those years ago. Others think it came back for me. Either way, no one ever saw me again. My name is Martin Reeves. I'm a park ranger at Everglades National Park, but my life hasn't always been about watching over swamps and wildlife. Before this, I was a Navy SEAL. I've seen my fair share of danger, but nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to face in these waters. I'm 47 now, but my body feels older. A classified mission years ago left me with a titanium leg and memories I'd rather forget. Some nights when the swamp is quiet and the stars are out, those memories creep back in, faces I've lost, mistakes I've made. I try to drown them out with work, long patrols through the Everglades that keep me away from people and their questions. I'm not exactly a people person anyway. Been married 3 times, divorced 3 times. Guess I'm better at navigating swamps than relationships. And yeah, I drink more than I should, but who doesn't have their vices? The thing is, out here in the Everglades, none of that matters. It's just me, the water, and the wildlife. The Everglades are beautiful during the day, endless stretches of green and gold with birds calling in the distance. But at night, it's a different story. The swamp changes when the sun goes down. The air gets heavier, the shadows deeper, and sometimes you feel like you're not alone. I'd heard stories from locals, legends passed down by the Seminole tribes about creatures that live in the water. They call them night swimmers. Supposedly, they steal voices and faces to lure people into the depths. I always brushed it off as folklore, just another ghost story to scare tourists. But then people started disappearing. It began with poachers, guys who came into the park looking to make a quick buck by hunting illegally or stealing rare plants. Normally, they're a nuisance more than anything else. But over the past few months, they weren't just getting caught, they were vanishing without a trace. At first, we thought they'd just skipped town to avoid getting arrested. But then we found their camps, abandoned airboats with claw marks on the hulls and gear left behind like they'd run off in a hurry. One of those boats even had a camera on board. The footage was corrupted, static, and glitches, but there were flashes of something, lights moving under the water. Something wasn't set right. And that's how it all started. Just another routine patrol that turned into something I'll never forget. I decided to check out the area where the poachers had disappeared. It was deep in the swamp, far from the usual trails tourists stick to. The Everglades are massive, miles and miles of wetlands, mangroves, and waterways that all start to look the same if you're not careful. Lucky for me, I know these swamps like the back of my hand. The camp was easy to find. Their airboat was still there, tied up to a tree like they'd planned to come back. But everything else, it was a mess. Gear was scattered everywhere, coolers tipped over, tents ripped open, and tools left lying in the mud. These guys weren't amateurs. They had high-end equipment worth thousands of dollars. No way they'd just leave it behind. The boat caught my attention first. It looked fine at a glance, but when I got closer, I saw deep scratches along the sides, long claw marks that ran from the top of the hull down to the waterline. Whatever made them wasn't small. I ran my fingers over the grooves, feeling how sharp they were. It didn't make sense. There's nothing in these waters big enough or strong enough to do that. Inside the boat, I found their camera. It was one of those expensive ones with night vision, a tool poachers use to track animals after dark. The battery was dead, but I took it back to my station and plugged it in later that night. The footage wasn't set normal. It started off fine, just shots of the swamp at night, quiet, except for the sound of insects and frogs. Then, about 10 minutes in, things changed. The camera started glitching, static cutting across the screen, and then there were lights. Strange lights moving under the water in patterns that didn't make sense. They weren't reflections or bioluminescent fish. They were brighter than anything I'd ever seen in these swamps. The lights moved closer to the boat, circling it like they were studying it. And then, nothing. The footage cut out completely. I couldn't shake the feeling something was wrong here, not just with the poachers, but with the swamp itself. So I took some water samples from the area and sent them off for testing at a nearby lab. When the results came back, they were weird. The water had traces of toxins I couldn't identify, chemicals that shouldn't exist naturally in this ecosystem. There were also elevated levels of phosphorescent bacteria, the kind that makes things glow in the dark, but way more than usual. Even stranger, fish from that area started showing mutations, extra fins, oversized eyes, and glowing patches on their scales. It felt like the swamp itself was changing. I didn't know what to make of it yet. But one thing was clear, this wasn't normal. Something was happening out there in those waters, and I needed answers. A few nights later, I decided to head back to the same area where the poachers had vanished. It was late, but that's when the swamp feels most alive. The air was thick and humid, and the only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the occasional splash of something moving in the water. I'd been out here 100 times before, but this night felt different. I was cruising slowly in my boat, scanning the water with my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, lighting up patches of lily pads and mangroves. Everything seemed normal. At first, just another quiet night in the Everglades. And then I saw them, moving beneath the surface. At first, I thought it was just reflections from my flashlight or maybe some bioluminescent fish. But these lights weren't random. They were moving in patterns, almost like they were dancing. They glowed softly, shifting from blue to green to white, and they didn't follow the current. Instead, they seemed to be coming toward me. I killed the engine and sat there in silence, watching as the lights got closer. My heart was pounding, but I couldn't look away. They started forming shapes, human-like figures that seemed to rise from the water. Their arms reached out toward me, beckoning me deeper into the swamp. I don't know how long I sat there staring at them, but eventually I snapped out of it and restarted the engine. As soon as I did, the lights scattered, disappearing into the depths like they'd never been there at all. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I went back out to patrol a different area of the park, one closer to where tourists sometimes wander off trail. That's when I found her. She was sitting on a fallen log near the water's edge, a young woman in her 20s with mud-streaked clothes and wide, terrified eyes. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. When she saw me approach, she flinched, like she thought I was going to hurt her. "It's okay," I said gently, holding up my hands to show I wasn't a threat. "I'm a park ranger. You safe now." She didn't say anything at first, just stared at me like she wasn't sure if I was real. Finally, she whispered, "They still out there." "Who?" I asked. Her voice shook as she answered, "The things in the water. They followed me for days." I helped her onto my boat and gave her some water while she told me her story. She was a graduate student studying water quality for her research project. She'd been camping alone near one of the remote waterways when she started noticing strange lights under the surface, just like what I'd seen. At first, she thought it was fascinating, something new to study, but then she realized the lights were following her. They stayed close to her camp at night and even seemed to mimic voices she recognized, her mother's voice calling her name from somewhere deep in the swamp. She tried to leave, but kept getting lost in circles no matter which direction she went. She swore she could hear whispers coming from the water and saw shadows moving just below the surface. When I looked closer at her skin under my flashlight, I saw faint marks, sucker-like circles that glowed softly in the dark. Whatever had followed her wasn't human. After I got the young woman back to safety, I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd told me. The lights, the voices, the marks on her skin, it all lined up too perfectly with what I'd seen. Something was out there in the swamp, something we didn't understand. And if it could do that to her, I needed to figure out what we were dealing with before anyone else got hurt. The next day, I went back out alone. This time I brought more gear. extra flashlights, a flare gun, and my old Navy SEAL knife. I didn't know what I was up against, but I wasn't going in unprepared. I headed deeper into the swamp than I'd ever gone before, following the lights from the night before and the area where the poachers had disappeared. It was quiet, too quiet. Normally, you'd hear birds calling or see gators sunning themselves on the banks, but here, nothing. No birds, no gators, not even insects buzzing around. It was like everything had just left. That seps when I saw them. A line of alligator skulls arranged neatly along the water's edge. They were old and bleached white by the sun, but they weren't random. Each skull was placed facing inward, forming a rough circle around a stretch of swamp about 5 miles wide. I stepped out of my boat and onto the soft ground to get a closer look. The skulls were spaced evenly apart, like someone or something had put them there on purpose. It felt like a warning sign, like whatever lived inside that circle didn't want anyone crossing into its territory. But I wasn't set about to turn back now. I climbed back into my boat and pushed forward into the marked area. The air felt heavier here, thicker somehow, and the water was darker than it should have been, almost black in some places. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, but I kept going. It wasn't that long before I got my answer. The first attack happened just as the sun was starting to set. I was moving slowly through a narrow channel when something slammed into the side of my boat so hard it almost tipped over. I grabbed onto the edge to steady myself and looked down into the water. At first, I didn't see anything, just ripples spreading out from where my boat had been hit. But then something broke the surface. A hand. No, not a hand, exactly. It was webbed, with long fingers and claws at the tips. It grabbed onto the side of my boat and started pulling itself up. That's when I saw its face, elongated like a fish, but with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the fading light. Its skin was translucent, stretched tight over its bones so you could see its organs glowing faintly beneath. I froze for a second. Just 1 second. But that's all it took for another one to appear on the other side of the boat. Then another behind me. They were everywhere. They didn't make any noise except for the sound of their claws scraping against the metal hull as they tried to tip me over. One of them reached for my leg, my real leg, but when its hand brushed against my titanium one, it recoiled like it had been burned. That gave me just enough time to grab my flare gun and fire it into the air. The bright light seemed to scare them off. They let go of the boat and disappeared beneath the water as quickly as they'd come. I sat there for a long time after that, clutching my flare gun with shaking hands and staring at the water around me. Whatever these things were, they weren't just animals. They were smart, and they weren't afraid to attack. I knew one thing for sure: this wasn't set over. After that encounter, I knew I couldn't keep this to myself anymore. Whatever those things were, they were dangerous, and people needed to know. But I also knew that if I went to my superiors with a story about glowing fish people attacking my boat, they'd think I'd lost my mind, or worse, that I'd been drinking on the job. So I decided to dig deeper on my own. I started by looking into the history of the area. The Everglades have been around for thousands of years, but there are parts of it that people barely know anything about. That's what makes it so fascinating and so terrifying. I remembered hearing stories from some of the older Seminole guides who worked in the park. They talked about creatures they called night swimmers. According to their legends, these beings lived in the deepest parts of the swamp and only came out at night. They could mimic human voices, steal faces, and lure people into the water, never to be seen again. At the time, I'd written it off as folklore, just another campfire story. But now I wasn't so sure. I also found records of strange sightings after a massive hurricane hit the region back in 1928. Locals reported seeing glowing figures in the water and hearing voices calling to them from the darkness. Some even claimed their livestock had gone missing, only for their bones to wash up weeks later, stripped clean. It wasn't just old legends either. There were government reports too, classified ones that weren't easy to find. In 1965, there had been an illegal chemical dump in one of the remote waterways. A company had been trying to save money by dumping toxic waste into the swamp instead of disposing of it properly. The chemicals caused mutations in local amphibian populations, frogs with extra limbs, fish with glowing scales, but the incident was quickly covered up. The more I read, the more it all started to make sense. Those toxins never went away. They just sank deeper into the ecosystem over time, affecting everything they touched. And whatever those creatures were, they weren't natural. They were something else, something created by us. After piecing together everything I'd learned, I started to feel like I was being watched. It wasn't just paranoia. Something had changed in the swamp. The air felt heavier, the water quieter, and every time I went out on patrol, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Then the gifts started showing up. It began with small things. Bones arranged neatly on my dock, like someone had gone through the trouble of cleaning and placing them there. At first, I thought it was just animals, maybe raccoons or otters messing around. But then it got stranger. One morning, I found a pile of items that didn't belong in the swamp. A pair of sunglasses, a broken watch, and a muddy wallet. When I opened the wallet, I found an ID that belonged to one of the missing poachers. My stomach turned as I realized this wasn't random. Someone, or something, had brought these items here deliberately. The next day, it got worse. On my dock was a severed hand, pale and bloated from being in the water too long. Clutched in its fingers was a photo of me, my old Navy SEAL service photo. The edges were torn and water-stained, but it was unmistakably mine. I hadn't brought that photo to the park. It was back at my station, locked away in my desk drawer 20 miles from here. That night, as I sat in my cabin trying to make sense of everything, my radio crackled to life. It was an old model, one we didn't even use anymore, and it shouldn't have been working, but through the static I heard a voice. "Help, help me, Martin." It was my voice. I froze, staring at the radio as it repeated the same words over and over again. "Help me. Coordinates, come quick." The coordinates it gave were deep in the swamp, right in the heart of where those creatures lived. My blood ran cold as I realized what was happening. They weren't just watching me, they were imitating me. They wanted me to come to them. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat by the window with my flashlight and flare gun, watching the water for any sign of movement. Whatever these things were, they weren't just animals or mutated fish. They were smart. Smart enough to know how to lure me out. And they weren't going to stop until I made a choice. Face them or run. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever these things were, they had crossed a line. They weren't just defending their territory. They were toying with me, drawing me in. And as much as every instinct told me to stay away, I knew I had to go back out there. If I didn't, someone else would stumble into this nightmare, and they might not be as lucky as I'd been. The next morning, I packed my gear and set out toward the coordinates the voice on the radio had given me. The swamp felt different that day, quieter than usual, like even the wind was holding its breath. The water was still reflecting the gray sky above like a sheet of glass. It felt like the whole world was waiting for something to happen. It took hours to get there, weaving through narrow channels and overgrown mangroves. As I got closer, I started noticing more of those markers' bones arranged in patterns along the banks, some of them human. The air smelled sour, like sulfur mixed with rotting vegetation. My stomach churned, but I kept going. Finally, I reached it. The nest. It was in a sinkhole, a deep pit in the middle of the swamp where the water turned a sickly greenish yellow. Floating on the surface were clusters of gelatinous sacs, each one about the size of a basketball. Inside them, I could see shapes, small, twitching forms that glowed faintly in the murky water. Eggs. Around the sinkhole were more bones, hundreds of them arranged in spirals and circles like some kind of ritualistic display. But what really caught my attention were the faces. They were floating in clear containers made from some kind of organic material, like jellyfish but tougher. Each face was perfectly preserved, their expressions frozen in terror. Some of them looked fresh. Others were little more than skulls with scraps of skin still clinging to them. I felt sick to my stomach, but forced myself to keep moving. I needed proof, something I could bring back to show people what was really happening out here. As I leaned over to take a photo of one of the eggs, I heard it. A splash. I spun around just in time to see something dark beneath my boat. A flash of pale skin and glowing eyes. Then another splash, and another. They were everywhere, circling me like sharks around a wounded fish. Before I could react, one of them lunged out of the water and grabbed onto my boat. Its claws dug into the metal as it tried to pull itself up. I fired my flare gun at it, hitting it square in the chest. It let out a high-pitched screech and fell back into the water, but more were coming. I started the engine and gunned it, speeding away from the sinkhole as fast as I could. They chased me for miles, their glowing eyes cutting through the darkness like headlights. Every time one got close enough to grab onto my boat, I'd fire another flare or swing at it with my knife. Eventually they gave up, or maybe they let me go on purpose. Either way, when I finally made it back to my station, I was shaking so hard I could barely stand. But it wasn't set over yet. When I got inside and locked the door behind me, my radio crackled to life again. This time, it wasn't just static or my voice being mimicked, it was screams. Dozens of voices crying out for help all at once, overlapping each other until they became one deafening roar. And then, silence. The screams on the radio didn't stop me. If anything, they pushed me further. I couldn't leave this alone. Not after what I'd seen. Those creatures weren't just hunting, they were doing something far worse. And if I didn't figure out what it was, more people were going to disappear. The next day, I went back to the sinkhole. This time, I followed the glowing fluid trail that had been left behind when they attacked my boat. It led me to a cave system half submerged in the swamp. The entrance was hidden behind thick mangroves, and the air around it smelled like decay. I tied up my boat and climbed inside, flashlight in one hand and my knife in the other. The walls of the cave were slick with algae, glowing faintly in the darkness. The water was shallow at first, but as I moved deeper, it rose to my knees. Every step echoed through the tunnels, making it impossible to tell if I was alone. And then I found them, the harvesting chambers. The first thing I saw was a table, if you could call it that, made from twisted roots and bones. On it lay a man, still alive but barely breathing. His skin was pale and covered in sucker-like marks that pulsed faintly with light. Around him were several of the creatures, working with tools made from sharpened bone and stone. They were cutting into him. Not randomly. This wasn't just killing for food, they were precise. Removing organs and vocal cords like surgeons, the tissue they took was placed into small containers filled with glowing fluid where it merged with smaller versions of themselves, adolescents still growing into their adult forms. I froze, unable to move or breathe as I watched them work. It wasn't just horrifying, it was organized. These things weren't mindless predators, they were intelligent, capable of planning and adapting in ways I couldn't comprehend. One of them turned toward me suddenly, its hollow eyes locking onto mine. Before I could react, it lunged forward and grabbed my arm. Its touch burned like acid, sending waves of pain through my body as my vision blurred. That's when it happened, the contact. I don't know how to explain it exactly, but somehow it spoke to me, not with words or sounds, but through images and feelings that flooded my mind all at once. It showed me visions of their world, how they'd evolved from creatures of the swamp into something more after being exposed to the toxins we dumped into their waters decades ago. They weren't just surviving, they were thriving, adapting faster than anything else on Earth. And now they saw us as obstacles standing in their way. "We are rightful," the voice said. Or maybe it wasn't that voice at all, but an idea planted directly into my thoughts. Earth is ours. I stumbled backward as the creature released me, its glowing eyes watching as I scrambled out of the chamber and back into the tunnels. My heart was pounding, my head spinning from what I'd just seen and felt. These things weren't just dangerous, they were planning something bigger, and if they succeeded, we wouldn't stand a chance. I barely made it back to my boat alive. My arm throbbed where the creature had grabbed me, the skin red and blistered like a chemical burn. My head was pounding too, filled with fragments of those images they'd forced into my mind. I couldn't stop seeing it. Their evolution, their plans. They weren't just staying in the swamp, they were expanding. When I got back to the station, I didn't have time to process what had happened. There were men waiting for me. Military men, one of them stepped forward, and my stomach dropped when I recognized him. Commander Briggs. He'd been my CO back when I was a SEAL. Seeing him here in the middle of nowhere told me one thing: whatever was happening in the swamp, the government already knew about it. "Martin," he said, his voice calm but firm, "we need to talk." I didn't trust him. Not after what I just learned, but I let him inside anyway. He didn't waste time getting to the point. "We've been monitoring this situation for a while," he said, pulling out a file and laying it on the table. Inside were photos, blurry images of the creatures, maps of their territory, and reports stamped with big red letters, "Classified." "These things, they're not natural. You figured that out by now." I nodded but didn't say anything. "They were a result of an incident." He continued carefully. "Back in SEP 65, there was an experimental chemical dump in this area. It wasn't supposed to leak into the ecosystem, but it did. And now we are dealing with the consequences." "Consequences?" I snapped, my voice rising despite myself. "These things are killing people. They are planning something bigger than this swamp." Briggs didn't flinch. "We know," he said simply, "that's why we are here." At first, I thought he meant they were going to wipe them out, burn the nest, destroy every last one of them. But then he said something that made my blood run cold. "We are not here to destroy them," he said. "We are here to study them." "Study them? Cool," I repeated, disbelief creeping into my voice. "They are an evolutionary miracle," Briggs explained. "They adapted faster than anything we ever seen. If we can harness that, well, imagine what it could mean for us, for medicine, for warfare." I stared at him, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. "You want to weaponize them," I said flatly. Briggs didn't deny it. "They are too dangerous," I said firmly. "You don't understand what they are capable of." "That's exactly why we need to control them," he shot back. It wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about power. And I realized then that I couldn't trust him or anyone else involved in this operation. That night, as Briggs and his team prepared their equipment for a containment mission, I went through their files again. That's when I found it. The evidence that confirmed everything I'd suspected. The chemical dump back in 65, it wasn't an accident. It had been part of a military experiment, a test to see how certain toxins would affect amphibian populations in extreme environments. They hadn't just created these creatures by mistake, they'd done it on purpose. And now they wanted to use them as weapons. I knew what I had to do. I didn't sleep that night, I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, those glowing eyes, those clawed hands reaching out from the water. And then there was Briggs, calmly talking about turning them into weapons, like it was just another day at the office. I knew I couldn't let it happen. These things were already too dangerous. If the military got their hands on them, there'd be no stopping what came next. The next morning, Briggs and his team loaded up their boats with gear, tranquilizers, containment units, and enough firepower to level a small town. They were heading straight for the nest, and I knew it wasn't just to study the creatures. They wanted specimens alive. I told Briggs I'd go with them. He didn't question it, probably thinking my ranger experience would be useful in navigating the swamp. But I had my own plan. We reached the sinkhole just as the sun was setting. The air was thick with that sulfurous smell again, and the water around us seemed to glow faintly in the fading light. The creatures were waiting. They always were. As soon as we got close, they attacked. It started with splashes, quick flashes of movement beneath the surface. Then they came up all at once, surrounding the boats like wolves circling prey. Briggs' men opened fire, their bullets cutting through the water and lighting up the swamp with muzzle flashes. But it didn't stop them. The creatures were smarter than that. They used tools, sharp sticks and rocks tied together with vines, and worked in packs to take out engines and disable boats. One by one, Briggs' men went down, dragged into the water by glowing hands that disappeared into the depths. I stayed on my boat, firing flares into the air to keep them at bay. But even as I fought them off, I knew it wasn't enough. There were too many of them, and they weren't going to stop until we were all gone, or worse. That's when I made my move. While Briggs was busy shouting orders and trying to salvage what was left of his team, I grabbed one of the fuel reserves from his boat and threw it into the sinkhole. Then another and another. "Reeves," Briggs shouted when he saw what I was doing. "What are you?" I didn't let him finish. Grabbing a flare from my pack, I lit it and threw it into the pit. The explosion was deafening. Fire ripped through the sinkhole, igniting everything in its path. The eggs, the glowing fluid, even some of the creatures themselves. The heat was unbearable, but I didn't stop. I grabbed another fuel reserve and threw it into the flames, watching as the inferno spread through the cave system like a living thing. The creature screamed a high-pitched sound that cut through me like a knife, but I didn't look back. Briggs tried to stop me, yelling about classified missions and consequences, but I wasn't listening anymore. This wasn't about orders or experiments or weapons. It was about survival. When it was over, there wasn't much left of the nest except for charred bones and scorched earth. The swamp was quiet again, but not in a peaceful way. It felt hollow, like something vital had been ripped out of it. I climbed back into my boat and started away from the scene, my body aching from burns and exhaustion. Briggs didn't follow me. He just stood there on his ruined boat, staring at what used to be his mission. But as I looked out over the water one last time, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Lights. Faint ones moving beneath the surface far away from where we'd been, too far for them to have survived what I'd done. They weren't set gone. It's been 3 months since that night, but it hasn't left me. Not the fire, not the screams, and definitely not the lights. I still see them sometimes, when I close my eyes, when I'm near water, even when I'm alone in my cabin. They're always there, just beneath the surface. Waiting. The official report said it was a methane explosion caused by swamp gas, a freak accident that destroyed part of the Everglades. That's what they told the press. Anyway, Briggs and his team disappeared from the park after that night, and I haven't heard from them since. Maybe they were reassigned, maybe they were silenced. Either way, I doubt they'll be coming back. But the swamp hasn't gone back to normal. The water samples I sent off after the explosion came back with the same results: unknown toxins, elevated phosphorescent bacteria levels, and mutations in local wildlife. And now those results are showing up 200 miles away in areas that should have been untouched. Whatever I did that night, it wasn't sept enough. I tried to go back to my old routine, patrolling the park, keeping tourists safe, but it's not the same anymore. Every time I step into the swamp, I feel like I'm being watched. Sometimes I hear voices, faint whispers calling my name from somewhere deep in the water. Other times, I see shadows moving just below the surface, too quick to catch but impossible to ignore. And then there was the package. It showed up at my station last week, wrapped in plain brown paper with no return address. Inside was a small glass container filled with glowing fluid, and floating in it was an ear. Not just any ear. It was hers. My ex-wife's ear. I knew it instantly, because of the small silver hoop she always wore in her left ear. She'd had it pierced as a teenager and never took it out. Not even after we split up. I don't know how they got to her or why they sent this to me, but one thing is clear: they're not done with me yet. I've started drinking again. Not just to forget, but to stay awake. Sleep feels dangerous now. Every time I drift off, I dream of lights pulling me into the water and hands dragging me under. It's only a matter of time before they come for me, or worse, for someone else. I thought burning their nest would stop them. I thought destroying their eggs would end this nightmare, but now I realize something terrifying. They're not just in the Everglades anymore. They're spreading. My name is Thomas Blackwood, and I've spent most of my life underground. I'm a park ranger at Carlsbad Caverns National Park in New Mexico, but my real passion is spelunking, exploring the deep, dark places most people wouldn't dare to go. I've mapped parts of the cave system no one even knew existed. It's quiet down there, peaceful, away from the noise of the surface world. But lately, I've started to wonder if the darkness is hiding something more than just rock and dirt. It all began on a routine exploration. I was checking out a section of the caverns that hadn't been fully mapped yet. My flashlight beam danced across jagged walls as I squeezed through tight passages, my boots crunching on loose gravel. That's when I found it, a narrow fissure in the rock barely wide enough for me to fit through. Warm air was blowing out of it, which didn't make any sense. Caves are supposed to be cold, and then there was the sound, soft clicks and chirps like bat echolocation, but different. It wasn't random. It had a rhythm, almost like it was trying to say something. I marked the spot on my map and radioed back to base about the discovery. A university research team had been studying some of the newer chambers nearby, so I figured they'd want to check it out. But when I mentioned it to them later that day, they seemed distracted, worried even. They hadn't checked in for hours and were overdue for their scheduled report. The next morning, I was asked to lead a rescue operation. The researchers' camp was deep in the caverns, but when we arrived, it was empty. Their tents were still set up, their equipment still running, lights blinking on cameras and sensors, but there was no sign of them. Not even footprints leading away from the site. One of their tape recorders was still on, so I rewound it to see if it had picked up anything useful. At first, all I heard were normal sounds, the researchers talking about rock formations and air samples, but then there was something else. Breathing, soft and steady, like someone standing right next to the microphone, and then whispers. Words repeated over and over in a voice that wasn't theirs. "Come closer," it said. I felt a chill run down my spine as I turned off the recorder. Something wasn't right here. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The rescue team and I decided to stay near the researchers' camp for the night, hoping they might return. But the silence in the cave wasn't comforting. It was heavy, like it was pressing down on us. Every sound echoed too long, making it hard to tell where it came from. After dinner, I set up some of my own equipment, a tape recorder and a small microphone, to see if I could pick up anything unusual. I've always trusted sound more than sight, especially since my vision's been getting worse lately. It's not something I talk about, but in the caves where light is scarce, I rely on my other senses to guide me. As we sat quietly, the microphone started picking up faint noises, skittering sounds, like something crawling along the walls. But when we shined our flashlights around, there was nothing there. One of the rangers joked that it was probably bats or rats, but I knew better. This wasn't normal. Later that night, while everyone else was asleep, I decided to explore a little on my own. My headlamp flickered as I moved deeper into the cavern, but I ignored it. The air was getting warmer again, and that clicking sound, the one I'd heard near the fissure, was back. It was closer now, louder, like it was following me. Suddenly, my headlamp went out completely. I froze in place, surrounded by pitch-black darkness. My heart pounded as I fumbled for my backup light. Before I could turn it on, I felt something touch my face, cool and dry fingers brushing against my cheek. It wasn't rough like an animal's paw. It felt human. I stumbled backward and finally managed to switch on my backup light. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there, just empty rock walls. My tape recorder was still running in my pocket, so I rewound it to see if it had caught anything. The playback sent chills down my spine. There were skittering sounds again, closer this time, and then a faint voice whispering words I couldn't understand. It didn't sound angry or aggressive. It sounded curious. I hurried back to camp and didn't mention what had happened to the others. They wouldn't believe me anyway, not yet. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I replayed the tape over and over, trying to make sense of the whispers and the strange movements. But the more I listened, the more uneasy I felt. Something was down here with us, something that didn't belong. As we searched deeper into the caverns for any trace of the missing researchers, I stumbled upon an old tunnel that wasn't on any of my maps. The walls were rough, not like the smooth limestone of the main chambers. It looked like someone had carved it out by hand. Curious, I followed it until I reached a small chamber filled with rusted mining equipment, pickaxes, lanterns, even a few rotting wooden crates. I found a leather-bound journal tucked inside one of the crates. The pages were brittle and yellowed with age, but I could still make out some of the writing. It was from a miner who had worked here in the late 1800s. He wrote about strange encounters deep in the caves, about hearing tapping sounds that seemed to mimic their tools and seeing pale figures in the darkness. One entry stood out. The children came again last night, pale as ghosts, with long arms and no eyes. They watched us from the shadows, whispering things we couldn't understand. We thought they were harmless until 19 men disappeared in a single night. I felt my stomach drop as I read those words. Pale children? No eyes? It sounded too much like what I'd experienced the night before. When I returned to camp, one of the surviving researchers approached me. She was pale and shaking, clearly terrified. She told me she'd been analyzing some of the sounds we'd recorded and had a theory about what might be down here. According to her, these creatures could be humans, or at least something that evolved from humans. She explained how people trapped underground for thousands of years might adapt to permanent darkness, losing their sight but developing heightened senses like hearing and touch. Over time, they could form a hive-like consciousness to survive as a group, sharing thoughts and memories through sound. Her theory made sense in a horrifying way. These creatures weren't just animals, they were intelligent, and they'd been here long before us. By now, I knew we were in serious danger. Whatever was down here wasn't just watching us, it was studying us. It had been listening to our conversations, mimicking our movements, and waiting for the right moment to act. I started noticing a pattern in the way things were happening. Every time someone's flashlight flickered or their equipment failed, it was like the creatures were testing us, isolating one person at a time. I spent hours going over the recordings we'd collected, trying to figure out what they wanted. The whispers were becoming clearer, repeating fragments of our own words back to us. It was eerie, like hearing your own voice coming from somewhere you couldn't see. Then it hit me. The tapping sounds we'd heard earlier weren't random. They were trying to communicate. I remembered the miner's journal and how the creatures had mimicked their tools. Maybe they were using sound as a kind of language. I grabbed a metal rod from the camp and started tapping it against the cave wall in simple patterns. 3 taps, then 2 taps, then 3 again. For a while, there was no response. The silence stretched on so long that I started to feel foolish. But just as I was about to give up, I heard it 3 taps, then 2, then 3. My heart raced as I tapped back again, this time adding an extra beat at the end. The response came almost immediately, matching my pattern exactly. They understood me. Over the next hour, I kept tapping out different sequences, trying to see how much they could follow. It was slow at first, but eventually, they started adding their own variations, patterns I hadn't tapped out myself. It was like they were teaching me their language. Then came the message that sent chills down my spine. 5 taps in quick succession, followed by a long pause, and then 5 more taps. I didn't understand what it meant at first, until one of the researchers pointed out that it matched Morse code for a single word: join. I froze as the realization sank in. They didn't see us as enemies or prey. They saw us as potential additions to their hive mind. They wanted us to become part of them. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. The idea that these creatures wanted us to join them was terrifying. What did that even mean? Were they trying to turn us into one of them? Were the missing researchers already part of their hive mind? The questions kept swirling in my head, but there were no answers. Just the steady, oppressive darkness pressing in from all sides. The next day, 2 rangers volunteered to explore a narrow fissure nearby, hoping it might lead to the missing researchers. The opening was so tight they had to crawl through on their stomachs, dragging their equipment behind them. They radioed back every few minutes to update us, but after about half an hour, the signal went silent. We called out to them, but there was no response. All we could hear were faint echoes of their voices coming from deep inside the fissure. I lowered a microphone into the opening, hoping it might pick up something we couldn't hear with our own ears. At first, the recording sounded normal, just the rangers talking to each other as they moved deeper into the passage. But then their voices started to change. They became slower, hollow, like they were speaking underwater, and then came the begging. "Help us," one of them said, his voice trembling. "Please, join us." The other ranger Sip's voice followed shortly after, repeating the same words over and over. "Join us." We tried everything to reach them, calling out, shining lights into the fissure, but it was no use. Whatever had taken them was too far in for us to follow. As if things couldn't get worse, my vision started deteriorating rapidly. It had been bad before, but now it felt like I was losing it completely. My eyes burned and watered constantly, and everything around me looked blurry and distorted. I knew I couldn't hide it much longer. One of the researchers noticed my condition and pulled me aside. She told me she'd been studying spores collected from the air near the fissure and found something alarming. They weren't normal cave spores. They were biological agents released by the creatures, designed to weaken human vision while enhancing other senses like hearing and touch. "They said they're grooming you," she said quietly. "They think you set to make a good candidate for their hive." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. Was this why my vision had been failing all these years? Had I been breathing in these spores without realizing it? And if so, how much time did I have left? I knew I had to keep going, even though my vision was getting worse by the hour. Every step felt heavier. Every shadow seemed darker, but I couldn't stop. The missing rangers were still out there, or at least I hoped they were, and I needed answers. What did these creatures want? Why were they doing this? While exploring a new passage, I stumbled into something that made my heart stop. It was a massive chamber, bigger than anything I'd ever seen before. The walls were lined with honeycomb-like recesses, each one holding a pale, motionless figure. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, were stacked in rows, their elongated limbs folded tightly against their bodies. They looked like they were sleeping. But it wasn't just the creatures. Among them were humans, partially transformed, their skin pale and stretched, their eyes sealed shut. Some of them wore clothing from different time periods, miners' uniforms from the 1800s, old-fashioned park ranger gear, even modern hiking clothes. They weren't dead. Their chests rose and fell with slow, steady breaths. I felt sick as I realized what was happening. These people hadn't just disappeared. They'd been absorbed into the hive. They weren't individuals anymore. They were part of something bigger. Before I could process what I was seeing, I heard voices echoing through the chamber. A group of people in military uniforms was making its way toward me, carrying high-tech equipment and weapons. They didn't look surprised to see me. In fact, it seemed like they'd been expecting me. One of them introduced himself as Dr. Harris, a scientist working with the government. He told me they'd known about the creatures for years, but kept it quiet to avoid public panic. According to him, the hive's ability to share memories and adapt biologically made it a potential goldmine for military research. "They set perfect soldiers," he said coldly. "No fear, no hesitation, complete unity. If we can harness their biology, we set'll have an unstoppable force." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. These creatures weren't monsters. They were survivors, adapting to a world without light, and now the government wanted to turn them into weapons. Dr. Harris told me their plan was simple. Capture a few specimens for study and destroy the rest of the hive to prevent any risk to the surface world. But as I looked around at the sleeping figures in the chamber, the humans and creatures alike, I knew this wasn't right. I didn't trust the military team. Their cold, calculated approach to the creatures felt wrong, like they were treating living beings as experiments instead of survivors. But I didn't have time to argue. They were already setting up containment equipment, metal cages, electromagnetic pulse devices, and sonic weapons designed to disrupt the hive's communication. As they moved deeper into the chamber, the creatures began to stir. The pale figures unfolded their limbs and turned toward us, their eyeless faces tilting as if they could sense every movement. The air grew thick with tension and the clicking sound started again, louder this time, faster, more urgent. The first trap was triggered. A loud pulse echoed through the cavern and several creatures collapsed to the ground, twitching violently. But instead of retreating or panicking, the rest of the hive responded with terrifying precision. They flooded the chamber with movement, skittering along walls and ceilings, collapsing tunnels behind them to cut off escape routes. The military team tried to fight back, but it was useless. Every time they fired a weapon or set off another pulse, the hive adapted. They used their elongated limbs to disable equipment and their paralytic secretions to immobilize soldiers. Within minutes, half the team was gone, dragged into narrow fissures too small for anyone else to follow. In the chaos, I felt something brush against my arm, a gentle touch, not aggressive or violent. One of the creatures stood in front of me, its pale skin glowing faintly in the dim light. It didn't attack, it just stood there, waiting. And then I heard it, the tapping sounds from earlier, but this time they weren't coming from the walls. They were inside my head, echoing like whispers in my mind. The hive was speaking to me directly. "You are blind," it said in a voice that wasn't a voice but a feeling, a vibration in my thoughts. "We can save you." I staggered backward, overwhelmed by what I was experiencing. The hive showed me flashes of their world, a sensory explosion where sound became color and vibration became light. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once. They weren't offering me survival, they were offering transformation. If I joined them, I wouldn't be blind anymore. I'd see in ways no human ever could. But I wouldn't be myself anymore either. I'd be part of them. The cavern was chaos. The creatures moved like a single living wave, their pale forms blending into the shadows as they overwhelmed the remaining soldiers. Screams echoed off the walls, but they were quickly swallowed by the clicking and tapping of the hive. I stood frozen in the middle of it all, my mind spinning from what they had shown me. The military team's leader, Dr. Harris, was shouting orders to his men, but it was clear they were losing. The sonic weapons had worked at first, but now the creatures seemed to anticipate every move. They collapsed tunnels, redirected air currents, and used the cave itself as a weapon. It was like fighting the earth itself. I knew I had to act. If I didn't, everyone, soldiers and creatures alike, would die down here. My vision was almost completely gone now, but I could still hear everything. The faint hum of the hive's whispers in my mind, the desperate shouts of the soldiers, and the rhythmic tapping that seemed to guide me. I made my way to the edge of the hibernation chamber, where a series of narrow passages led deeper into the hive's territory. The creatures didn't stop me. They parted like a wave clearing a path. They knew what I was about to do. Dr. Harris saw me moving and yelled after me. "Blackwood, what are you doing? You're going to get yourself killed." But I ignored him. He didn't understand. I reached a central point in the cavern system, a weak spot where several tunnels converged. If I triggered a controlled cave-in here, it would seal off most of the hive's chambers from the surface world, cutting them off from human interference while giving them a chance to survive deeper underground. But there was a cost. If I stayed here too long, I wouldn't make it out in time. The hive must have sensed my plan because their whispers grew louder in my mind. "Stay," they said. "We will save you." I hesitated for a moment. My vision was gone now, completely black, but in its place I felt something else, an awareness of everything around me. The vibrations of footsteps on stone, the faint rustle of air currents through narrow passages, it all painted a picture in my mind more vivid than sight ever could. The creatures weren't forcing me. They were offering me a choice. If I joined them, I wouldn't just survive. I'd become something more, but I couldn't give up who I was. Not yet. With trembling hands, I set off a series of charges we'd brought for emergencies like this. The ground shook violently as rocks tumbled down around me, sealing off the main chambers one by one. Dust filled the air, and for a moment, everything went silent. When I woke up, I was lying near the entrance to one of the upper chambers. Somehow, the hive had carried me out before the collapse trapped them completely. My vision hadn't returned, but I could still feel their presence, faint whispers at the edge of my thoughts. The military team had been forced to retreat after losing most of their men. Dr. Harris didn't say much as he passed me on his way out. Just a cold glare that told me he blamed me for everything that had happened. The park reopened weeks later with new restrictions on certain areas of the caverns. Officially, the incident was blamed on unstable rock formations and gas leaks. Nothing about missing researchers or strange creatures. But sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in my office, I find things that weren't there before. Maps of unmapped chambers drawn with impossible precision or faint tapping sounds echoing through sealed-off passages. And every now and then, I hear them whispering, "Thank you." My name is Catherine Donovan, but most people just call me Ranger Donovan. I've spent the last 10 years patrolling the Olympic National Forest in Washington, a place I know better than the back of my hand. It's not just a job for me, it's my life. This forest has been my home ever since I was a kid. Back when my dad and brother were loggers, they loved the trees, but they also cut them down. I guess that's why I became an arborist first, and then a ranger later. I wanted to protect what they couldn't. But this forest isn't like other places. It's alive in ways most people don't understand. You hear things out here, whispers in the wind, branches creaking like voices, animals moving in ways that seem coordinated. I've always felt there was something watching me, especially when I wander deep into the old growth areas where the trees are so big it feels like stepping into another world. Maybe it's just my imagination, or maybe it's because of the stories my dad used to tell about forest guardians. He said they were spirits that protected the ancient trees, but I always thought he was just trying to scare me. That was before everything started happening. It began with the poachers. Illegal logging is a big problem out here, and I've made it my mission to stop it. But this time was different. We found two men strung up in trees, their bodies twisted and tangled in roots that had grown right through them, like the forest itself had swallowed them whole. Their blood wasn't blood anymore, it was amber-colored sap. The sight of it made my stomach turn, but what really got to me was how fast it had happened. Those roots had grown overnight. The local sheriff didn't know what to make of it, but he chalked it up to some kind of freak accident or animal attack. I knew better. This wasn't normal, not even close. Then there were the trail markers. They showed up out of nowhere, small stacks of stones and carved wooden symbols pointing away from certain parts of the forest. When I asked some of the local indigenous elders about them, they refused to talk about it. One man told me, "Stay away from the walking trees," and wouldn't say another word. I should have listened. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Really wrong. The forest felt different. Heavier somehow, like it was holding its breath. Every time I went out on patrol, I'd catch glimpses of things that didn't make sense. Shadows moving where there shouldn't be any. Trees swaying even when the air was perfectly still, and animals acting strange. Deer would freeze and stare at me with wide, unblinking eyes, and birds would stop singing the moment I stepped into certain areas. Then there were the logging sites. A few of them had been hit by what looked like sabotage. Chainsaws were snapped clean in half, trucks had their tires shredded, and entire stacks of cut logs were burned to ash. But here's the weird part. It wasn't random destruction. Whoever or whatever did this had precision. The cuts on the equipment looked like they had been made by tools, not claws or teeth. But when I checked the motion-activated cameras we'd set up around the sites, all I saw were trees swaying in the wind. No people, no animals. One night, I decided to patrol one of the illegal logging sites myself. It was late, and the forest was pitch black except for the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air smelled damp and earthy, but there was something else underneath, a faint metallic tang that made me uneasy. I was about to head back when I saw it. At first I thought it was a man carrying something heavy, a body maybe, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a man at all. It looked like it was made entirely of twisted branches and roots, its limbs creaking as it moved. Its eyes glowed like molten amber in the dark, casting an eerie light on the ground around it. It didn't walk. It glided, slipping through underbrush as if it wasn't even solid. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. All I could do was watch as it disappeared into the trees with its burden, a lifeless logger whose face was pale as death. When I finally managed to pull myself together and follow its trail, there was nothing there, no footprints, no broken branches, not even a hint that anything had passed through. It was like it had melted into the forest itself. The next day, I found myself digging through old records at the ranger station and asking questions about strange incidents in the area. That's when I learned about a pattern: violent deaths near logging operations going back over 100 years. The details were always vague, but indigenous accounts described the forest taking back what was stolen in blood. It sounded ridiculous at first, like something out of a campfire story, but after what I'd seen, I wasn't so sure anymore. I couldn't stop thinking about that thing, the way it moved, the way its eyes seemed alive, and what it meant for this forest. After that night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing amber eyes staring back at me. I knew I needed answers, but I didn't know where to start. That's when I remembered something. My dad's old journal. I hadn't looked at it in years. After the accident that killed him and my brother, I couldn't bring myself to go through his things. But now, something told me it might hold the key to understanding what was happening in the forest. I dug it out from an old box in my cabin and started flipping through the pages. Most of it was what you'd expect: notes about logging jobs, sketches of trees, and little reminders about equipment. But toward the end, his writing changed. It became different. He wrote about strange things he'd seen deep in the forest, trees that seemed to move when no one was looking, animals acting as if they were being watched, and whispers that came from nowhere. He called them timber guardians. One entry stopped me cold. The forest isn't set just alive, it sets aware. The old growth stands are its heart, and it protects them fiercely. Blood wakes the sleeping heart. Blood. The word sent a chill down my spine. Was that what had happened to those poachers? Had their blood somehow triggered something? My dad's last entry was even more unsettling. If we take too much, it will take back what is owed. The date on that entry was the day before the accident that killed him and my brother. I didn't know what to think. Was my dad trying to warn us, or had he just lost his mind after spending too much time in the woods? Either way, I couldn't ignore the feeling that this was all connected. My family's tragedy, the poachers, the walkers, all of it. I started digging deeper into local history and found reports of similar incidents going back over a century. Every time logging operations expanded into untouched parts of the forest, people would go missing or turn up dead under mysterious circumstances. The details were always vague: freak accidents, wild animal attacks, but indigenous accounts told a different story. They spoke of walking trees and a mother tree at the heart of the forest that could wake its children to defend itself. It sounded impossible, but so did everything else I'd seen. I knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over. Whatever was happening out there wasn't going to stop on its own. I wasn't ready for what came next. The forest wasn't just warning us, it was fighting back. It started with a logger who stumbled into the ranger station one morning, barely able to stand. His face was pale, his clothes soaked in blood, and his arms were covered in deep gashes. But it wasn't just the cuts that caught my attention. His wounds were filled with splinters. Not normal splinters, though. These were thick, dark pieces of wood, almost like roots, and they seemed to be growing under his skin. He collapsed before he could say much, but I managed to get a few words out of him. The trees, they stepped out of their own shadows. His voice cracked as he said it, and then he passed out. We rushed him to the hospital, but things only got stranger. The doctors tried to remove the splinters, but they wouldn't stop growing. They spread through his body like vines, twisting around his bones and muscles. By the time I saw him again, his skin had started turning rough and brown, like bark. He didn't look human anymore, and when he woke up, his eyes glowed amber. I knew then that whatever was happening in the forest wasn't just about protecting trees, it was changing people. I started digging deeper into the logging companies operating in the area. What I found made me sick. The executives knew about the walkers, or at least they knew something dangerous was out there, but they didn't care. To them, worker deaths were just part of the cost of doing business. They'd been falsifying reports and disposing of bodies to keep everything quiet while they pushed deeper into the old-growth sections of the forest. One report stood out. A memo from a company higher up warning that the forest resistance is escalating. Resistance. They made it sound like they were at war with the woods, and maybe they were. I confronted one of the executives at a town meeting, but he brushed me off like I was crazy. "Trees don't fight back," he said with a smirk, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He knew I was right. The more I learned, the more it felt like everything was spiraling out of control. The walkers weren't just targeting loggers anymore. They were spreading beyond the forest, showing up near homes and towns where company employees lived. Their attacks were getting smarter, more coordinated, as if they were planning something bigger. And then it hit me. This wasn't random violence. The forest was trying to send a message, a warning that we'd gone too far. But how do you reason with something that isn't human? Something that doesn't think or feel the way we do? I didn't know if it was even possible, but I had to try. I thought I understood the forest, but I was wrong. It wasn't just alive, it was ancient, powerful, and angry. And now it had noticed me. It happened during one of my patrols. I was following a trail near the old growth section, trying to figure out where the walkers were coming from. The air was thick and still, like the forest was holding its breath. I felt like I was being watched, but when I turned around, there was nothing there, just trees stretching endlessly into the dark. Then I saw it, a walker standing just a few feet away. It didn't move or make a sound. It just stared at me with those glowing amber eyes. My heart felt like it had stopped beating. But before I could run, it reached out and touched my arm. The moment its hand brushed my skin, everything changed. I saw things, memories that weren't mine. I saw centuries of life in the forest, animals thriving, trees growing tall and strong, and then humans coming in with their saws and machines, tearing everything apart. I felt the pain of the trees being cut down, their roots ripped from the earth. It wasn't just destruction, it was betrayal. The forest had trusted us once, but now it saw us as invaders. The memories hit me like a wave, overwhelming and endless. For a moment, I wasn't Catherine Donovan anymore. I was part of the forest. I could feel its anger, its desperation to protect what little it had left. But beneath all that rage was something else. Sadness. The Heartwood wasn't just fighting to survive. It was mourning everything it had lost. When the walker let go, I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air. My arm burned where it had touched me, but there was no mark, just a strange warmth spreading through my veins. I didn't know what had happened to me, but I could feel something different inside. The forest wasn't just watching me anymore. It had connected with me. Somehow I'd become part of it. I didn't want to believe it at first. I didn't want to accept that I might be changing. But deep down I knew the truth. The forest had chosen me for something, and there was no turning back. After that encounter, I couldn't look at the forest the same way. I could feel it now, like a low hum in the back of my mind. The trees seemed to lean toward me when I walked by, their branches brushing against my shoulders as if they were trying to tell me something. Animals didn't run from me anymore. They watched me, calm but alert, like they knew I wasn't just another human. But the forest wasn't calm, it was preparing for war. The logging company wasn't backing down. After losing workers and equipment, they brought in mercenaries, men armed with chainsaws, flamethrowers, and heavy machinery. They weren't just cutting trees anymore, they were clearing entire sections of the forest, burning as they went. The air was thick with smoke, and the ground trembled under the weight of their machines. The walkers responded immediately. They came in greater numbers than I'd ever seen before, stepping out of the shadows like an army rising from the earth. They didn't just attack the machines, they targeted the men operating them. I watched from a distance as roots shot up from the ground, wrapping around a bulldozer and crushing it like it was made of paper. The driver barely escaped before a walker dragged him into the underbrush. It wasn't just happening in the forest anymore. The walkers started appearing in nearby towns, targeting logging company employees in their homes. One night, I got a call from a terrified worker who claimed a tree had broken through his living room window and tried to pull him outside. By the time I got there, all that was left was shattered glass and claw-like marks on the floor. The attacks were getting more coordinated, more deliberate. It was like the forest was learning, adapting to fight us on our own terms. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I was part of it now, whether I wanted to be or not. I tried to mediate, to find some kind of middle ground between the forest and the people destroying it. But no one trusted me anymore. Not fully. The loggers saw me as some kind of traitor, too sympathetic to the forest cause. And the walkers, well, they didn't speak, but I could feel their doubt every time they looked at me with those glowing eyes. Then things took a turn for the worse. The logging company captured one of the walkers, dragged it out of the woods with chains, and loaded it onto a truck like it was some kind of trophy. They planned to study it, figure out what made it tick so they could destroy the rest. That was all it took to push the forest over the edge. The next night, Every walker in the area activated at once. Trees that had stood still for centuries began to move, their roots tearing through roads and buildings as they marched toward the logging camps. It wasn't just retaliation, it was an uprising. And I knew there was no stopping it unless I did something drastic. I knew what I had to do, even if it terrified me. The forest wasn't going to stop, not until the logging company was gone, and maybe not even then. People would die and the violence would only spread. The walkers were desperate, and so was the Heartwood, but I was the only one who could bridge the gap between them and us. The elders from the nearby indigenous community agreed to help me. They didn't trust the logging company, but they understood that endless bloodshed wouldn't solve anything. One of them, an older woman named Eliza, guided me to a place deep in the forest, a grove I'd never seen before, where the trees were so ancient, they seemed to glow in the moonlight. At the center of the grove stood a massive hollow tree, the Heartwood itself. Its interior walls were carved with strange pictographs showing humanoid figures emerging from its roots, just like the walkers I'd seen. The air around it felt alive, buzzing with energy that made my skin tingle. Eliza explained the ritual. If I offered myself as a conduit, a living link between the Heartwood and humanity, it might stop the violence. The forest would trust me to protect its ancient core, while I worked to ensure humans respected its boundaries. But it wasn't without risk. Once I connected with the Heartwood, I'd never be entirely human again. I didn't hesitate. If this was what it took to save both sides, I was willing to do it. The ritual was simple but powerful. Eliza placed her hands on mine and whispered words in a language I didn't understand. The Heartwood's roots wrapped around my feet, pulling me closer until I felt its energy surge through me like fire and water all at once. When it was over, I wasn't the same. My body looked human, but I could feel the forest inside me, its thoughts, its memories, its pain. Plants grew toward me when I walked by, blooming out of season as if they recognized me now. The walkers retreated that night, melting back into the woods. The logging company mysteriously lost all their permits after a fire destroyed their records. And as for me, well, I stayed in the forest as head ranger. My cabin is quiet now, except for one strange thing: my father's journal keeps filling up with new pages written in a language no one can translate. The forest is watching through me now, and it's waiting.